All right. Deep dive.
Deep dive. Guys, we went hard.
We are wading in to the depths of neoliberalism.
I am so excited to talk about this ideology.
I am too. I had no idea what it was until you mentioned it last week to me.
No shit.
No idea.
That's
I mean,
crazy.
don't you remember? He asked me, who would you think is a neoliberal in government right now?
Yeah.
And I said Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Which is so crazy.
Which is the exact opposite.
And this is where I think we should start here, because this is what's so interesting, right? We live in the world of neoliberalism. It is the ideology of the current world system, especially in the United States. And it's like living under Stalinist Russia and not knowing what communism is. That's what it's like. And so many Americans live under neoliberalism and have never even heard it. Now, on another side, there are a lot of people online on the left-wing circles who'll claim that the moderate side of the Democratic Party are currently neoliberals. And that's not accurate either.
You don't think so?
No. It's not. I don't think it is. Like Joe Biden. Is Joe Biden a neoliberal?
No, but I would argue the moderateness of Joe Biden. Like, I don't think Joe Biden's a neoliberal, but I think Bill Clinton and Barack Obama were.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah,
that's fine.
Hillary Clinton.
Hillary Clinton was definitely neoliberal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Biden is not, but there are definitely other moderate Democrats in Congress that are.
Definitely are neoliberal. Yes, sure. So, do you want to start with the history of it? Or the basic principles? Where do you want to begin?
Probably, what is it?
What is it?
Yeah, right. If I didn't know what it is and we're already talking about it, we should probably define it.
Okay.
So, ideologies are hard to define. I would probably start by saying, think Reagan, right? Your basic principles here are small government, as little government spending as you can, and thus as little taxation as you can have, to let kind of an unfettered free market do its thing. It completely espouses the benefits of the market. It thinks the market is better at everything than the government might be.
Mm-hmm.
And so the more that we can remove government from the workings of the market, and essentially what they want is, they understand that the government has to start a market, they have to create it. So what they want is for the government to start it, to like make the big bang for the market to go, and then sit back and watch. They're kind of like economy deists.
Economy deists. I like that.
Yeah.
They want like the track and field to be upkept, right? They want the turf to be, nice and manicured, but they don't want anyone regulating the game being played on that turf.
Yes.
And I think there is there's a deeper philosophical aspect of neoliberalism. And it's the belief of religious almost devotion to the market's ability to organize society in a way that makes the market the society itself. And
yes,
in previous economic organizations and societal organizations, we had religiosity as the dominant factor above all else. We had devotion to other men as a dominant factor. But the market always existed within those things. And the market always existed within a religious society, in a communal society. The market still existed inside of it.
Yeah.
And with neoliberalism, it is the decision to break out of it, for the market to break out of those systems, and the market to envelop those systems. And for all of those systems now exist within the market itself, and then society becomes the market.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, one of the most damaging aspects of it, because the amount of alienation that takes place within a society and the commodification of things
Yeah.
that should have never been commodified.
Yeah.
The commodification of human labor.
Totally.
The commodification of the necessities to life.
Sure.
With the commodification of these things, we are now putting up barriers for complete and total human progress.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'd say we're not viewing people as humans anymore. We're viewing them as economic units.
Economic units, exactly.
And I think if anybody watching this reflects on how they think about people, how they think about themselves, how they think about what success means to themselves, they'll realize just how pervasive that is. And I think that's why this is an interesting conversation.
Right.
Is not just because of the political influence it's had, but the cultural, societal influence.
Yeah.
But I feel like we should now, I feel like we established pretty well what it is.
Yes.
Skip back and take a little walk through history.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll get back to what's going on now and
Yes.
ideology a little bit. So I started at the Great Depression.
Okay, I want to go further back.
Okay.
I want to go further back because I want to talk about classical liberalism.
Sure.
What is the difference between classical liberalism and neoliberalism? Well, the first liberal is hard to find, but let's say we start at John Locke, 1690. He wrote the Second Treatise of Government. Inspired a lot of American revolutionaries at the time, right? Say we talk about John Locke. He comes out of the British Revolution and the Glorious Revolution, and he's like, say for the sake of argument, he's the first liberal. Then comes Adam Smith. Adam Smith is a neoliberal compared to John Locke. He is a new liberal, right? And he is now applying the liberal theory to his new moment in time.
Mm-hmm.
And then comes Ricardo. Ricardo takes what Adam Smith has done, and Ricardo builds on new liberalism and neoliberalism. And the term isn't coined yet. They're not calling themselves neoliberals. They're liberals. But it's that the neoliberal idea is that it's liberalism applied to the current situation of the day. And so everything I've said, the definition that we've given so far for liberalism, for neoliberalism, applies to that definition of liberalism in its most past self. The neo part is how it applies to the aspect of the modern times. And we make this shift where we take when I was talking about the market being a part of social relations and a part of society, to exploding out and becoming all of society. Researchers and social scientists put that moment of explosion in 1834 with the passage of the Poor Laws in England. And the Poor Laws made it illegal for you to be poor and without a job. You had to find a job if you were poor. And this was when labor became commodified. And that commodification of labor is when humans become tools of the market.
Yep.
And humans and markets are no longer a tool for humans.
Yeah. It's like if it's illegal to not work, not to provide value to the market, then all of a sudden it starts to seem like the most important thing about you is your value to the market.
Exactly. But now let's skip to 1929, the Great Depression.
Yeah.
And the moment when liberalism dies.
For a time.
When liberalism dies and our modern connotation of neoliberalism is born.
Sure. So the Great Depression happens and it sends the world, and definitely America, into this horrible economic time. Unemployment spikes to over 20%. People are losing their homes. People who had previously been middle and even middle upper class were now homeless and hungry, and people were blaming capitalism. They were blaming the unfettered markets of liberalism and looking for a change. And so you get FDR to come in and implement the New Deal. But he had gotten the New Deal from the ideas of this guy, John Maynard Keynes. And Keynes was kind of the first influential non-liberal in the West,
Yeah.
or at least the most influential non-liberal. Keynes's main idea was less. It wasn't about completely leaving the government hands off, right? He thought that government spending would be extremely helpful in times of recession. He said liberalism is mostly good, but it doesn't help in times of recession. In times of recession, you need a little bit more of a kick from the government. And so he thought the main problem causing recessions was a lack of demand.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, we can stimulate that by infusing some money into the economy from the government, spurring demand. And there's this idea of a multiplier effect where the government will inject some money into the economy, and then the economy, that each dollar the government spends will return more on itself. So the government will be able to pay off its debts as time goes on.
Yeah. It's accounting for the economic growth that the demand will bring.
Exactly.
Right? Because that demand is going to then spur production, boost GDP, boost the tax base, get more money later on.
Totally. And so, on the other hand, if you didn't have government investment, you can have consumption decline, private investment decline, and then as the economy gets worse and worse, you have investment that wants to be even more hands-off, and you just get into this downward spiral that you can never escape.
And that, what America faces that during the Panic of 1873. And in the Panic of 1873, the government doesn't do anything. And that largely leads to the railroad strike of 1877, the Great Upheaval, as it's called in America, and one of the largest strikes, if not the largest strike in American history, shuts down railroads across the country. And the president was actually so scared. Hayes was the president at the time, was so scared because he thought this was communism coming to America. And he was genuinely frightened that labor was going to take over the country. And he calls in the National Guard to put them down. But the point is, 1873 is a great example. The Great Upheaval of 1877 is a good example of what may happen if you don't take the proper fiscal policy steps in 1873 during the panic.
Yeah.
Right?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Totally. And so the one thing that anyone might be thinking is the same thing that people think and people complain about whenever the government spends money in large sums now: inflation. Keynes acknowledged the likelihood of inflation, but he argued that employment was a more important metric to focus on, and that inflation would be a fair price to pay for that higher employment.
Like, he makes a real massive, like his whole ideology is around the idea of full employment is the most important thing. End of story, full things flat. Like, it's just full employment is the goal of an economy.
Yeah. Which I would probably agree with. Or close to that.
I mean, I think it's interesting now currently. The Federal Reserve in its charter is tasked with two things: maximize employment, reach full employment, and limit inflation. Mm-hmm. That's the Federal Reserve's written charter. Every time Jerome Powell has come out and talked about the Federal Reserve, he always leads and emphasizes, and sometimes only says, limit inflation and bring price stability.
I wonder if that's the context that we're in now, though.
That it is the context we're in now, but that's what's happening. Oh, no, you mean the context because of...
Does he say that because that's the context we're in now?
Oh, I don't agree.
I don't think inflationary. So. Okay, that's just a question.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think it's a sign of the priorities.
The hold of neoliberalism?
The hold of neoliberalism, yeah, because as we'll talk about, the neoliberalism, if Keynes's goal is full employment, neoliberalism is to limit inflation. If Keynes is to bring about the full employment, neoliberalism is the exact opposite of that.
Exactly. And the reason, I'll give a reason for why I think full employment is better, and why I'm sure you do too, is because the problem with inflation is you can't buy as much. Mm-hmm. But if you are employed, you probably can buy the bare essentials. You probably will have enough money, and this is not always true, and we see this today, but you will will probably have enough money to house and feed your family. And it is helping that very bottom and trying to employ them and give them money that I feel like is most important.
Yeah.
So while this was happening, there was another school of thought. And that was called the Austrian School. And it was led by a guy named Ludwig von Mises.
What a guy.
Yeah. And he thought fundamentally differently from Keynes on government spending. Keynes thought that government spending would create more value than was invested, whereas Mises thought it would lead to unprofitable, unsustainable projects that would inevitably lose value when they had to be shut down. Like you said, it was mostly concerned with inflation rather than economic employment. They had this belief that the supply of money is what causes economic inflation or economic fluctuation.
Right, the monetary theory of, a very monetarist theory of inflation.
Yeah, the supply side versus the demand side. So these ideas started to build and build, but Keynes won in the West. And so where this happened was Bretton Woods, as far as I know. This is fast forward from 1929. FDR had used Keynes's ideas in the New Deal, right?
The Labor Party in Britain does that too.
Yes.
William Beveridge, he charts a new plan for welfare state in Britain, and the in a book titled Social Insurance and Allied Services, they have a 3% unemployment target. They have a creation of a national healthcare service, and they have a creation of a pension system. Keynesianism through and through, and this becomes the post-war consensus. And as you were about to go to, the post-war consensus is built at Bretton Woods.
Yeah, this hotel in New Hampshire where World War II is ending, and the Western Allied countries all got some delegates together and were deciding how the world was going to be run.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of things were decided there, one of which was let's all trade and be nice. I feel like there's more that I'm missing about Keynesianism or about what was said at that conference. I don't know if you have anything.
Which conference are you talking about?
Bretton Woods, or not conference? Yeah.
No, at Bretton Woods. So the thing I have about Bretton Woods is the two main big players, the UK and the United States. These are the allied powers that are leading the Bretton Woods Convention. Okay, and the UK representative is Maynard Keynes. The US representative is Harry Dexter White. And these two men have conflicting ideas about what they're doing there. Keynes comes at this as someone who's trying to solve the problem of stability, someone who's trying to bring about global economic growth. Harry Dexter White comes in with a different goal. Harry Dexter White is coming in for the best deal for America. These are two different ideas here, two different goals, and they come to a head. Keynes proposes the creation of an international clearing union. Now, what does that mean? This international clearing union would basically be an international bank, and it would print its own currency that would exchange national currencies at a fixed rate. And this would provide nations a unit for measuring trade deficits or surpluses. Now, the reason that's so important is countries, between debtor countries and creditor countries, could balance each other out without any unnecessary economic slowdown. And this idea of having this one world currency was very scary to the United States, who viewed its global hegemonic opportunity being at risk by this creation of this new global currency. So Harry Dexter White is refusing the International Credit Union proposal flat out. And instead of having this new currency that would be changed at fixed rates, he insisted that the US dollar would be the global reserve currency and that you can optionally convert it into gold. This is when we're on the gold standard. And so that moment is when I think Keynesianism was doomed to fail.
Really?
Because it's no longer the international order is now so heavily weighted
Too concentrated.
to United States concentrated power.
Yeah.
That creates too many contradictions in too many different areas that will never make the creditor countries happy with the debtor countries.
Yeah.
And the International Monetary Fund, which gets a really bad rep today, as it should, was proposed by Keynes to be very moderate in its approaches to dictating countries on how to spend the money, or in many cases, the International Monetary Fund should be lenient with payback times and should encourage Keynesian economic growth, stimulating demand.
Mm-hmm.
Harry Dexter White refutes this, and he says the IMF should be a regular bank that made sure those who pay their loans pay them back on time and dictate economic policy to be more austeric in its nature to ensure that the loans get paid back on time. The austeric part of that sentence means that limits to government spending and limits to the creation of new social services.
Okay.
So while Keynes is okay with the IMF investing in the long game, saying, yeah, be late paying us for the first 5 years, but if you take these economic steps of large infrastructure, educational investments, pay us back in 20, Harry Dexter White says, no, you pay the IMF back right now as soon as you can.
Mm-hmm.
And Harry Dexter White wins basically all of it.
Mm-hmm.
So the two main things that come out of the Bretton Woods Convention are the creation of the World Bank, which would speed up infrastructure projects through lending, and the creation of the International Monetary Fund with fixed exchange rates. Those are the two big things coming out of Bretton Woods.
Okay.
And it creates the international Keynesian order.
Yeah. And I think Keynes was still
happy with it.
Yeah.
Like he was like, I'm happy this is happening compared to nothing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Like this is way better than nothing. And it was way better than nothing.
It was great. They called it the golden age of capitalism.
For a good reason.
Yeah.
Between 1949 and 1979, there were not any global recessions.
No.
Really none.
No. There were far fewer financial crises than in the same amount of time succeeding this. I think it's something like 38 so I have like the years, about 30 years between 45 and 75 versus like 250 in the same period immediately after.
Right.
OECD members, the rich countries, were growing at a rate of 4 to 5% per year.
Crazy.
That's crazy right now. We're at 2 to 3% if we're lucky in those countries. Much lower wealth and income inequality, which is something that I'm kind of waiting to talk about until we get further on in the history, but is interesting because it doesn't really come up in these ideologies.
Inequality is never mentioned ever.
No.
Keynesianism nor neoliberalism.
Exactly. And much lower than normal unemployment, as Keynesianism called for.
And inflation at 4%, which isn't that bad.
No.
Until the stagflation of the 70s, right? That's when it kind of changes.
Well, that's exactly the problem that Keynesianism runs into. That's when it falls apart. So meanwhile, even when Keynesianism ruled the world, it wasn't just the Austrian school anymore. It was a few other schools. And von Mises was not alone. There were two other guys who I have as the main characters of this movement, Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman.
God, Friedrich Hayek. Road to Serfdom was one of the first political books I ever read.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Back in high school.
So they were both heavily influenced by Mises. So you talked about this deep underlying philosophical idea of commodifying people. I think from their points of view, because I don't view these people as evil. Right now, neoliberalism presently is used as a very derogatory term.
Yeah.
I think all of these men truly had good intentions in mind.
Especially reading their thought processes. It makes like sense.
Yes.
Like it actually does. And they have like fairly good arguments. Keynes refutes a lot of them, but they have fairly good arguments, and I want to talk about them.
Yeah. Well, what I have here is Hayek and Friedman they're concerned ultimately with freedom. And this is how I view republicanism now.
Yeah.
This is what neoliberalism means to me. It's the individual not being coerced into anything by the state.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess I would limit that to economically, not being coerced economically. I think this is kind of where neoliberalism is separate from libertarianism.
Mm.
Libertarianism is that full stop. Neoliberalism, it's a little more flexible as far as the social order that the state can impose. But this is where their views that taxation should be as low as possible come from. They argue that everyone is ignorant as to what will provide the most welfare for an individual.
Yeah.
So it is not right. So the only person who is right to make those necessarily
Is themselves.
limited decisions is themselves.
It is themselves.
Yeah.
Hayek believed institutions, and so Hayek is kind of coming into this at a very interesting time in history, because he grows up in Vienna, and he's exposed to radical Marxists throughout his life. And originally, he's kind of like okay with socialism. Like, he's kind of interested in it.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't necessarily hate it. But the main thing that pushes him away is the socialist calculation problem. And that, did you get a chance to look at the socialist calculation problem? Have you heard that phrase? The socialist calculation problem, I think, is the most important thing, and it comes from Mises. And he says socialism cannot rationally determine the proper distribution of resources due to the lack of market prices.
Mm.
And because there are no market prices, socialists will not be able to adequately determine the things that have value to people. And so the absence of profit means that there are no means for economic decisions, and it would be impossible to do so. And as you're saying, people themselves individually will only know what's best for their own individual welfare. So they should be the ones that are determining the value of things in their own right.
Yes.
And because of the socialist calculation problem, how do you best determine who gets what? Hayek, who is a fan of Darwinism, whose father was a botanist, has a very Darwinist perspective on the world, a social Darwinist, he thinks that humanity itself, and this is when neoliberalism gets very philosophical, right? Humanity itself is one gigantic organism.
Mm-hmm.
And every price at the market is a neuron in a brain. And we are connecting the neurons with every purchase we make. And all those purchases and all of those transactions and the interactions we have with people is then informing itself the best distribution of resources.
Mm-hmm.
And any interference in that is misguided, is wrong, and you're interrupting this spontaneous process of human ingenious that is too smart and too complex for any one or group of individuals to ever understand or plan more rationally. It's almost like an anthill.
Yeah.
Like an anthill going out and burrowing underground, finding the best places to find food.
Yeah.
And that's what they believe is happening.
One additional technical difficulty that we didn't expect this episode, that's all right. We know how to deal with it. We were talking about the socialist calculation dilemma, essentially. And I was about to go into how it does really trigger quite a think as a modern leftist who, and I'm not someone who generally identifies with neoliberalism. And I think the reason that I advocate more for some kind of centralization of government or of the economy is because even though these transactions that happen within the market of neoliberalism are, I kind of concede that they will be beneficial for both sides, there's still enormous opportunity for exploitation. So even though a transaction might still be a net positive for someone, the more wealth that is concentrated in certain areas and in the hands of certain individuals or organizations, the more they can exploit the other players in the market, the more they can drive them all the way up to the edge of whether or not something is a beneficial transaction to make. And the more that those people are pushed to the edge, the more suffering they face economically in other parts of their life.
And I think we see that a lot when we look at the inflation rates and the rise in prices of goods that are necessities to life.
Yes.
Right? When we look at health insurance costs, education costs, shelter costs, these are things that just consistently outpace. And it's not due to spontaneous neurons. It's due to the ability for people to suck up money out of the system.
Yeah.
It's not this grand organizational natural Darwinian process that's bestly allocating all resources to where they need to be. That's not what's happening.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like neurons. It feels like kind of black holes almost.
Like magnets.
Yeah. And the wealthier nodes of this system are stronger magnets that suck everything in from outside.
Yes. And so what's so interesting about this mindset is this isn't what neoliberalism had to be. There was a choice. After the decline of classical liberalism and Keynesianism gets applied in the United States, it gets applied in
Western Europe
and the United Kingdom. William Beveridge proposes a program of 3% unemployment rate, a national health service and pension reform, New Deal. We got the Social Security Act. We have child protection laws. We have unionization rights. There's a push towards a demand-driven economy, a Keynesian economy. In response, liberals meet in 1939. And this here is where the term neoliberalism is coined, at the Walter Lippmann Collegium Hotel in Paris. And liberals are deciding what is going to be the new liberalism that comes out of the ashes and leads the world into greater prosperity than what it did before. How do we respond to this Keynesianism, this movement for massive government overreach, really? And then they have to answer this very, very difficult question for a liberal. Does liberal markets need to take into account the need for Social Security? Some said yes. Ruthoff, he was a German liberal. He subscribes to a different type of economics than other liberals of the time, and he is in favor of some type of interventionism and sees how liberalism can destroy itself, and we need to find those flaws and change them. Hayek and Mises say no, liberalism does not need to take into account the need for any types of Social Security. And so at this meeting in 1938, neoliberalism is given a definition. And it's so interesting because it shows that neoliberalism didn't have to become what it became. This is the definition they said. The use of the price mechanism as the best way to obtain the maximal satisfaction of human expectations. That makes sense. I imagine that fits right in the whole of neoliberalism. The responsibility of the state for institution of a judicial framework adjusted to the order defined by the market. Of course, that makes perfect sense for a liberal. The possibility for the state to follow goals other than short-term expedients and to further them by levying taxes.
It's so funny because that is such a precise description of my critique of my understanding of neoliberalism.
Yes.
Is that it doesn't allow for that.
Well, that's what's so interesting is some people like Ruthoff are recognizing the flaws and they're going to attack that flaw directly, right?
Mm-hmm.
The next one, and this is the last one, the acceptance of state intervention if it does not favor any particular group and seeks to act upon the cause of the economic difficulties. This is neoliberalism almost ceding a lot of ground to Keynesianism.
This almost sounds like what I believe at this point. It's super close to leftist ideology now.
It's close to what a modern-day American progressive would be in favor of.
Yeah.
Then the issue is, why didn't this happen? Why did neoliberalism become something different than what they defined it as in 1938? Well, the answer is the invasion of Poland in 1939. And all the economists and all the liberals who gathered there are put back to their own countries and are forced to focus on the war effort and forced to focus on winning the war. Even at the time, Hayek and Keynes Hayek and Keynes had a long feud in the 30s. Hayek would write papers in articles and magazines directly calling out Keynes.
Yeah.
Keynes would respond. Keynes would be like, "You're a bitch. You suck.
You're an idiot.
You're an idiot. You're dumb as hell." And Hayek would be like, "No, poo-poo, you're dumb."
Yeah.
But after the war started, Hayek and Keynes stopped fighting entirely. Hayek was like, the number one priority is defeating Nazi Germany, and I am not going to get in your way, Keynes. Right now, you've won out. You won. This is your time. It's your time to shine.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to mess with you, but I'm coming for you later.
Yeah.
And that's when, like, it really goes deep, and the movement for a new liberalism begins to show its head again as the war is ending. And we see that Germany is going to lose, Nazism will fall. And now Hayek forms, along with other neoliberals, the Mont Pelerin Society. And in the Mont Pelerin Society, they meet in Switzerland. And this organization and this meeting, for all, just to be plain and transparent, is funded by massive business owners, a lot of corporate interests. Friedman actually attended this, and Friedman's very young by this point. He's a very young kid.
Mm-hmm.
And what's so funny about this is they're all debating about what liberalism should do to focus on taking on the New Dealers and labor. And would it be different from laissez-faire capitalism, of the classical liberalism? Will it be different? And it's so funny because they're all yelling at each other. And at one point, Mises stands up, and some of the liberals are arguing for a progressive tax. And Mises stands up and he goes, "You're all a bunch of socialists. If you believe in that, get out of here. You don't belong here."
Yeah.
And he's getting up and he's yelling at them. And it's just so interesting to me that there's so much infighting still.
Yeah.
You know?
Mm-hmm.
And there's this intellectual battle of what liberalism could and should be. And I don't... At that point, you read a quote by Hayek earlier where Hayek was suggesting that he's in favor of a healthcare system.
Yep.
And I don't know... I know that a lot of people who follow Hayek now and who subscribe to the Austrian School of Economics believe that that quote was taken out of context and believe that Hayek would not be for government healthcare today, or even a minimum basic income. He would not be for those things today. That's what they suggest. I wonder what Hayek is thinking in this moment and why he's against all of this. Because Hayek makes the decision to be against a progressive tax system. Hayek makes the decision to be against the New Deal and labor policies of the National Health Service. Why does he do that if that's what he's writing in Road to Serfdom? And that's what confuses me.
Maybe he's just inconsistent.
Maybe he's human. Right?
Shocker.
Maybe he's a human.
Yeah.
But I think I wanna go into the Road to Serfdom a little bit and talk about that, because that's like the meat of Hayek's belief system.
Yeah.
And it's such a popular book across the world that literally they run out of them.
Mm-hmm.
And due to paper shortages because of the war. And people talk about how it's the book that can't be obtained, it's this wanted commodity. And when it gets translated into English, and imported into the United States, it becomes massively, massively popular. And the main point of this book is an attack on Nazi Germany. But he makes this point, which I do not understand. If any degree of socialism was permitted, all the great hallmarks of Western civilization would disappear and look like Nazi Germany. Mm-hmm. And that is such an intense statement.
Yeah. The
great hallmarks of Western civilization? If any degree of socialism was permitted? That's intense.
That's what he's talking about by the Road to Serfdom. And that's something that struck me often in reading about neoliberalism. We talked about a lot of the tenets of the ideology. I think the one that we didn't really mention, that now is the perfect time to, is this fear that any amount of government control is necessarily putting you on a slippery slope to all of the government control.
Yeah. There
And-
can be no middle.
Yeah, and that's an extremely dangerous but also powerful idea, especially when we get into a Cold War with the Soviets, right? And so it becomes more than taboo to be interested in support aspects of communism or socialism.
Mm-hmm.
And personally, when I was reading this and reading about both Keynesianism and neoliberalism, and really getting deep into these ideas and why do they think these things, and it's a theme that I've talked about on the show before, it emphasizes to me how much some kind of middle road is needed,
Mm-hmm.
how values from each are needed, how the extremes of neither can ever work positively. But I also see why the extremes of either side are so captivating to the mind,
Oh, yeah.
because it feels the most logically pure. Like, if you go all the way to the logical extreme and you sit there and you plant your flag there, you have answers to every question.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't, it's kind of an easy way of not worrying about what the outcomes are going to be.
When I read about Hayek and Keynes, I view Keynes as the pragmatist.
Yeah.
And I view Hayek as the ideologue.
Same.
And I think only an ideologue could talk like the way Hayek does. Because when he talks about the great hallmarks of Western civilization being destroyed by any degree of socialism being permitted, he talks about the destruction of the Christian ethic,
Mm-hmm.
Greek and Roman tradition, and all who came before us, including Cicero and Thucydides, would be abandoned. What does any of that have to do with a national healthcare service?
Yeah. With the economy.
What does any of that have to do with the economy? And that's what I don't understand.
And it's interesting because this is where certain of these policies and what they're considering socialism, I think I see a little bit of difference here. What all of these government policies that Hayek even mentions in The Road to Serfdom, like government construction of infrastructure, social insurance for natural disasters, the health insurance, the basic minimum income.
Mm-hmm.
You know what they aren't? They're not unions. They're not worker power. And that's the basis of socialism and communism, right? It's the workers control the means of production.
Mm-hmm.
And Hayek doesn't say anything about that.
Not even once.
Keynes doesn't say anything about that.
Nothing.
And that's the interesting thing to me as well, is I think reading about Keynes more and more made me feel like he's
not a socialist
he's
at all.
probably right of center.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think he isn't pro-union. He heaped praise on, I don't know if it was Hayek, because I think after the war they might have become friends.
They did.
Right? I think it was Hayek. He heaped praise on Hayek for most of what he said in The Road to Serfdom, with one slight complaint.
No, he has
that I'm
one
forgetting
disagreement,
about.
and it's like kind of it's a disagreement that attacks the idea that there can be no middle.
Yeah.
Because at one point Hayek insinuates that there could be a middle.
Mm-hmm.
At one point he does say that there could be, and then Keynes is like, dude, if you're gonna say it at any point that there could be a middle, now you're just on my side, because I am also trying to find that middle.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Exactly.
So the second he admits that there could be a middle, then that's it.
Yeah.
He also makes this interesting point of capitalism versus democracy. And I am of the belief that the true spectrum of politics is the axis of capitalism on the right and democracy on the left. And we have to decide, how are we going to distribute resources? Is it going to be through a market, or is it going to be through government planning?
Oh, interesting.
But through democratic government planning. That's
Okay.
like my axis.
Okay.
That's my line. But what he says here is he is challenging the idea that democracy cannot tolerate capitalism. Because think about what's just happened. The Soviet Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, revolutions all over Europe. Capitalist liberal states have descended into totalitarian dictatorships like Nazism. And there's a theory that fascism is the last stage of capitalism. And capitalism breeds fascism,
Mm-hmm.
the inequalities, the poor living conditions, the the commodification of humanity leads people to become more frustrated, upset, and angry.
I think we could argue that we're seeing that now.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're right. I think they're right. I think fascism is the final stage of capitalism. But he's saying that that's not true. And he says only in capitalism is democracy possible. But he also says something else, which I think shows the true colors of the neoliberal. Where this is my biggest issue with neoliberalism, probably. He says that our generation thinks too much about the value of democracy. And he calls it a fetish. He says that democracy itself is not the value. The things that it serves is the value. And he specifically says that democracy is just a means and is a device for safeguarding individual freedom. And this is a very interesting statement because democracy of itself is not your value. Your freedom is. Well, then what is your definition of freedom? And his freedom is the freedom of the market. That's his only freedom. And so he values the freedom of the market above a democracy. And there are representatives in the United States, Senator Mike Lee from Utah, who have specifically said this, that democracy is not more important than freedom. What does that mean? Because in America, you really associate freedom and democracy as one and the same.
Yeah.
But that's not the neoliberal consensus of it. The neoliberal mindset is freedom is actually in like a total battle with democracy.
Yeah, it's not the freedom to choose who governs you, it's the freedom to choose where your money goes.
And that's the true ultimate freedom for the neoliberal. And then the next part I want to talk about from The Road to Serfdom that makes me that I have the most amount of issues with, is when he says that Nazism is a result of economic planning. And he says that Nazism is the result of socialism. Nazism came from the left, not from the right. And that's what's frustrating to me, because Nazism as a political ideology was, I want to say, almost not concerned with economics at all. It was one of hatred. It was one of xenophobia. It was one of destruction. It was one of control. But it was not one of economic ideology. They didn't have one. And I can know this because after the Nazis take power, they privatized the government services in mass. The Nazis privatized several banks. They privatized shipyards. They privatized railways. They privatized shipping lines. They privatized welfare organizations and other industries. So this is the opposite of central planning. When the Nazis take power, they start distributing and decentralizing all of their control to all their little Nazi lackey business buddies.
Yeah.
So I don't know where Hayek suggests that this is the rise from totalitarianism and socialism when it was just, that's not what the Nazis did.
Well, would it be because they were all their little Nazi business buddies? And so even if it wasn't centralization technically, it was centralization in spirit?
I don't know, because every businessman was a Nazi business buddy. Like every business guy in Germany was a pro-Nazi guy.
But I think that might be the point.
You think that, like, you think he was...
Like, that's their way of exerting the central power. Is by, like, because they privatized all these industries, but only by giving it to loyal business owners.
But that's not socialism at all. And that's what makes me frustrated with Hayek's interpretation.
Sure. Because
a socialist would say we need to collectivize all these industries. We need to bring them under control of the state. We need to, make sure that they're all planned accordingly to the basis of human need, not for the basis of profit. That's the opposite of what's happening in Nazi Germany. So for him to accuse that of that is hard for me to accept.
Sure, that makes sense.
And also, when we talk about, if he's going to come out and say that Nazism is growing from socialism, who were the first people in the camps? Communists. Who were the second people in the camps? The labor union leaders. Who were the third people in the camps? Socialists. Then the Jews. Like, the first people who were killed are the communists, the labor leaders. Then the Jews start getting killed. It's like the first people who were attacked were the communists.
I still don't know. I don't think. I guess I can see the reasoning to still draw the connection to between Nazism and the more leftism. Like, I mean, what I was saying before about how it's still kind of being centralization in spirit, but also, like, that's why the communists and the socialists and the labor leaders were the most dangerous people, because they would advocate for a similar type of empowerment of the people, but not under the hateful rule of the Nazis.
I guess.
Yeah.
But I don't think that the Nazis ever intended to give power to the people.
No.
Because they gave it to the
That's
business
true.
leaders.
Yes.
So, like,
yes.
and also all the business leaders were pro-Nazi.
Yeah.
So, like, it's what the business leaders wanted.
Yeah, I think the key difference here is that the Nazism led to the centralization. It's not the other way around. It's not that a centralized economy or government becomes hateful. I think I would probably argue that it's the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's the main point that I would attack in that reasoning.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense.
But voter serfdom is very popular.
Yeah, still.
Still. I mean, it was the first book I read about political philosophy. It's actually the second. The first one was The Second Treatise of Government by Locke.
Okay.
And then it was Voter Serfdom.
Are these like good reads?
No.
Okay.
But they were important.
Sure.
Like, I think I learned a lot from John Locke.
Okay.
For sure. John Locke is way better than Hayek.
Okay.
John Locke is actually banging. His theory of value and labor is actually really good.
Yeah.
It's almost Marxian.
Okay.
If you take it to its logical extreme, which we could talk about at some point, but it's really good.
Okay.
Cool. And so at this point, Road to Serfdom is popular. Mont Pelerin is all set up. And then there's a statement of aims at the end of the meeting at Mont Pelerin. And these are the goals, 3 goals. The essential conditions of freedom are gone as policy has attacked them. So they are asserting that freedom is, the conditions of freedom are gone due to the New Deal and the labor parties. Freedom of thought and expression is threatened, as some looking for tolerance can use power to suppress all views but their own. That one sounds like a racist dog whistle to me, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know another way to read that. I might be wrong. I don't know. But that sounds like a racist thing to me. I don't get that.
Say it again for me.
Freedom of thought and expression is threatened, as some looking for tolerance can use power to suppress all views but their own.
I mean, I can hear it as a racist dog whistle. I can also hear it as current modern progressives, or not even progressives, not even be the word, but Democrats on Twitter.
Yeah. Right?
I mean, I think it resonates more to me with Democrats on Twitter today
That's
than
how
anyone else.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
And that the world is in a decline of belief in private property in the market. So this is the framework of what they're working in. This is their worldview.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to do everything they can to change the global perspective and the global understanding of the benefits of private property. And how are they going to do that?
They write and they make connections. But the thing is, Keynesianism is doing so well.
Mm-hmm.
And they wait. And that's
they bide their time.
They bide their time. They wait for an opening.
And they do the long game. They get in, the liberal programs start integrating themselves into physics departments, into biology departments. And different think tanks are being made to prop up the neoliberal ideology.
Yep.
And different business leaders are funneling money into these organizations so that there looks like there's more strength behind each of the principles that they're citing.
Totally. Yeah, there's a concerted effort on all fronts. Like they get into the universities. They since they make these think tanks, they're now publishing academic research, right, to back their points. So, I mean, I think two of the most well-known organizations still today, Heritage, Cato Institute.
And we talk about Cato Institute all the time.
Yeah, they're still strong resources for them to use and to produce knowledge, quote unquote, for their cause.
Yeah. And so and then we get to the throughout the 40s and 70s is the rise, or just the heyday of Keynesianism. And we've talked about how great it was, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't great if you were black, wasn't great if you were a woman. But it was great on a paper perspective.
For the economy.
Yeah.
The numbers, yes.
Yes. But now neoliberalism is buying its time. And I want to talk about what happens in Chile.
Okay.
Do you think this is a good time, or do you have something else?
Well, because I think that comes a little bit after when neoliberalism really takes its chance.
Well, Chile happens in 73.
Really?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Maybe I guess I would still talk about these in different order. But
okay. No, you go then.
So I think basically what happens is in 1970, the economy enters this thing called stagflation. And this is super important because the basis of Keynesianism was this specific relationship between inflation and unemployment. It was like, okay, if unemployment goes down, inflation goes up. If inflation goes down, unemployment goes up. We'll stay in this stable, low unemployment, moderately higher inflation point, but where the economy will still be strong. But stagflation undermined him, because stagflation is both of those things happening at once. It's inflation and it's higher unemployment. So how did this even happen? And it's honestly hard for me to wrap my head around.
Well, it's hard for anybody to wrap its head around. It's not like an easy question that you could just answer on Google.
Exactly. Except there was one person who did, and we'll get to that.
Okay.
But what I found, the reason that it did happen is because of inflation expectations. So while the government raised interest rates to try to tame inflation, and this inflation was also caused by some price shocks due to Middle Eastern countries shutting down their oil supply because of our support of war in Israel, I believe. So that was driving inflation because of the supply shock. We implement interest rates or higher interest rates to cool inflation, but people expected inflation to continue despite the interest rates because of the supply shocks. And so business owners kept raising their prices, expecting inflation to continue. So even if inflation could have naturally cooled down because of these interest rates, the business owners kept forcing it to go up. And so they made the money, but they still weren't confident enough in the economy to really invest in hiring people that much. So unemployment stayed high, and it was this scary spiral. And all of a sudden it was like Keynes was wrong. He didn't know. And the person who had predicted that stagflation would happen was Milton Friedman.
Right.
So Milton Friedman has a quote, which is one of the probably best things to take away from him, is that when there's a crisis, people use the ideas that are lying around at the time. So that was what was so powerful about neoliberalism. They had spent all this time, they'd bided their time, they were building up their pile of ideas, and all of a sudden the thing happens that lead neoliberal shill Milton Friedman had predicted. It's like,
there it is.
He's our savior. We can grab these ideas. And so just like that, after 1973, Nixon ends up resigning, getting out of office. This is probably where it's good to talk about Chile. But all I know is Milton Friedman becomes an advisor for Gerald Ford.
Yeah. Well, Milton Friedman is integral to Chile.
Yes.
So in 1973, or in 1970, or 71, 70, around there, Salvador Allende becomes president of Chile in a democratic election. And he's a Marxist. He's a democratic social reformer. Doesn't want to rip up the Constitution of Chile, but he wants to make a lot of changes to the government and the economy. And he wins with a fairly good victory, forms a good coalition with the socialists and the communists, and he starts implementing some massive Keynesian policies. He increases the wages for government workers, he increases social services, and he buys up copper mines. He kicks out the United States copper companies, and Nixon is furious, and he says he says to to Kissinger that we are going to make the Chilean economy scream. And in 1973, the Chilean economy goes into hyperinflation. Part of it is because Allende raised wages too fast, and productivity did not keep up with the new demand. Keynesianism suggests if you boost the demand, productivity will come. But Allende spooked the capitalists, and no capitalist wanted to invest in Chile in fear that his business would get expropriated, so there was no boost in production. This happened with the copper mines as well. He expropriated the copper mines. The people running the copper mines went to different countries. You now have copper mines being run by not the best people. There are issues here. Socialist theorists and critics of Allende suggested that maybe he could have done a 50-50 arrangement with the business leaders and the government. Maybe he could have gone slower, right? He's doing a lot in a couple years. Fidel Castro, he says that Marxist revolutions are ones that are based on production. The revolution that Allende is pushing is one based on consumption. So Fidel Castro had a real big problem with what Allende was doing. And another big problem for the Chilean economy, copper prices dropped by 50%. And there is a lot of evidence to suggest that between the years of 1950 and 1990, the Chilean economy was almost perfectly correlated with copper prices. So when copper prices dropped 50% year over year, Chile went into a massive recession. And in response, other factions inside of Chile were growing resentful towards Allende. And during the midterm elections, Allende's party lost. And in the new Congress, it was about 55% right-leaning, 45% Allende supporting. But the middle ground were the Christian Democrats. And the Christian Democrats on paper were actually somewhat socialist. The Christian Democrats favored a lot of Allende's policies. And the Christian Democrats tried to bargain with Allende to prop up his government if he cools down on the amount of expropriations. And if he stops a lot of the expropriations and allows foreign capital to come back into the country and encourage more investment, then we will push for more worker-owned enterprises as Christian Democrats, and we will push for more social services. But you need to cool it with the expropriations. The communists sign on to that plan. The socialists don't. And so Allende doesn't end up signing the paper. And by Allende not signing that deal, he signed his death warrant. Because a year or so later, strikes break out across the country, strikes against Allende, and the labor leaders step up. And it's the business leaders pushing the strikes. The business leaders are trying to shut down the country, but the workers are showing up to work anyway. The workers are driving the trucks despite the business owner telling them not to come. The workers are running the mines despite the business owner locking the doors. And the workers are trying to prop up Allende's government because even though they know it sucks, they say this might be a bad economy, but it's my economy. And they're happy that it's theirs and it's a socialist economy, or at least it's transitioning.
Yeah.
This doesn't work. And the military, which first defended Allende, eventually switches as the main general changes guard to Augustus Pinochet. And Pinochet takes Allende. Allende is killed, and Pinochet takes control of government and institutes a military dictatorship backed by U.S. weapons and U.S. Interests. And Milton Friedman comes in as the number one economic advisor. And these are the Chicago boys. The guys from the University of Chicago is the hub of Austrian and neoliberal economic thinking in the United States. And these Chicago boys, when they go to Chile, basically remake the Chilean constitution in a neoliberal's dream. And they apply this theory of economics called shock treatment, shock therapy. They stop all tariffs completely, open up everything to global trade. They drop all tax rates completely. They suspend all social services. They privatize all government institutions. And the initial reaction and the initial economic effects are worse than what happened under Allende's leadership for the first 2 years. For the first 2 years, it's way worse. Uncomparably worse. Wages go down. Poverty goes up. Education achievement goes down. Everything is worse. But in the next few years, it gets better and better and better. And by now, Chile is the most successful Latin American country in the world. And that's something that socialists and Keynesian liberals have to reckon with. Why did that happen? But what I really want to get from that is neoliberalism is ruthless in its desire and willingness to do whatever it takes to get power. And it's different from liberalism, classical liberalism.
You think so?
Yeah. I think neoliberalism is more ruthless in its desire to take foothold in a nation.
Okay.
The fact that they allied with a military dictatorship, and this is the first place neoliberalism is tried in the world. Chile is the first place. And it's through a military dictatorship, a military coup, the killing of a leader, the killing of all labor leaders. Everyone gets killed, and it's the first time neoliberalism comes around. And I think that is actually what separates neoliberalism and classical liberalism from most of all, is neoliberalism's ruthlessness to create itself. But that is the story of Chile, and it's important to know because it is the first place neoliberalism is tried. And the fact that it comes from a military dictatorship, I think, is emblematic, from my perspective, of a lot of what neoliberalism is and how it values democracy and what they mean by freedom.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And so after Milton Friedman's massive success in Chile, quote unquote success, right? Whatever you mean.
He gains the ear of Gerald Ford.
There we go.
First of all, and he takes a little break while Jimmy Carter is president from 1976 to 1981. And then Reagan enters office.
And then it all changes.
Yeah.
Everything changes.
And Reagan is enormously successful in implementing neoliberal policies in the U.S. Drops the top tax bracket rate enormously. He also has Friedman on as one of his close advisors who he listens to all the time. Reagan is the like king neoliberal politician in my mind.
Oh yeah, he is the apex of their power.
Exactly. Yeah. And he does it all except weirdly he also does spend a lot. I assume it's mostly on the military.
It is. It's mostly on the military.
As he's trying to end the Cold War. But he does ramp up the deficit a lot, or the debt a lot.
But think about what neoliberals say that you can do with the government. Protection.
Yes.
And so, especially protection against a communist specter on the other side of the world. I can't think of a more important thing for neoliberals to spend money on.
Yeah.
Especially since this neoliberalism has proven to be so ruthless in its desire to expand itself.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that. It doesn't do great things for employment, as we would probably expect, and it does really bad things for equality, for wealth and income equality. And again, so this is something that Keynes didn't talk about, that Friedman wasn't particularly worried about, Hayek wasn't worried about. And inequality started to grow and grow because Reagan stripped back the power of government to regulate our corporate institutions.
Right. And
once he did, we have not really looked back.
Never once. And I think that if those black holes in this neuron economy existed, Reagan just threw fire in them and expanded them by tenfold in a matter of months.
Yeah.
Right. And it's just sucking everything in its path into these black holes of corporate power and corporate entities.
Totally. And this is what we see now. And it makes me think of Stiglitz, right? And it's we just have industry after industry of consolidation, of oligopoly, of, I don't know, 3 companies owning 89% of the market, owning 77% of the market, owning 92% of the market. It's that is the black hole, becoming more dense. It is the star dying and collapsing in on itself.
You said that Reagan was the apex of neoliberal power. And I think that's true. And I agree with that. But I think there's another interpretation that Bill Clinton was the apex.
Yeah.
Because it is the new labor movement in the United Kingdom. Because that is the moment where neoliberalism takes both parties. Where Labour Party in the UK and the Democratic Party in the United States were supposed to be the parties to protect labor from capital.
Yeah.
Now, there is no party to protect labor from capital in this moment in time with Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
With Obama. There is no labor protecting.
And my interpretation of that is deciding it wasn't politically viable.
Yeah.
That it wasn't an option to win on that stance.
Which I cannot believe to be the case.
It is wild to me as well. And of course, we weren't there. We don't really know.
I have no idea
what the fervor for Reagan was like, and whether even in 92, if that was still kind of reverberating.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't know.
Let's end here. I think
I have one thing that I want to mention about the 90s.
Okay.
Because the interesting thing is neoliberalism's staying power, I think, partly is because it accounted for the thing that Keynes missed. It accounted for what happened during the Reagan years. And then even when... But the thing is, neoliberalism said that you needed higher unemployment and lower inflation. It was kind of the opposite of Keynesianism in that way. The thing is, in the 90s, there was a lower inflation employment equilibrium than neoliberalism would have predicted.
Mm-hmm. There was.
The economy was really good. But it has staying power because that hole in neoliberalism was a positive thing.
Mm.
No one, and this is the thing, even Friedman's quote, right? In a crisis, people look at the ideas lying around. When things are going good, no one questions what's happening. And so neoliberalism has been able to perpetuate things going, I don't know, good enough for long enough that it's stayed thus far. And I think maybe the thing that you're about to get to is right now, perhaps things have finally deteriorated enough.
I think 2008 changed everything.
Mm.
And 2008 was the death of neoliberalism. Or at least the beginning of its demise. And there, in a different world, in a different time period, that would have been the death of that system.
Yeah.
In a different world, we would have risen up and done more to change the economic mode. It didn't happen. Now, but I think that neoliberalism is on its deathbed. Trump is an example of that. Bernie Sanders was an example of that. And Joe Biden's economic policy is a prime example. Joe Biden's Made in America policy is a rejection of the free market ideology of neoliberalism completely. Mm-hmm. He is only buying American products for even the input things that necessitate making a product. Mm-hmm. From the federal government's perspective. He is not encouraging any foreign movement of capital at all.
Yeah.
He has a planned industrial policy through the CHIPS and Science Act.
Yeah.
This is a Keynesian economic policy where we are pulling money abroad, putting it in the United States, demanding what sectors go to it, and then dictating almost how that money is spent in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
We passed the American Rescue Plan during a time of massive recession, which was a spur of demand, right?
Yeah.
That's what that was. That was a choice to spur economic growth through demand. And the United States, because of that, has the largest GDP growth out of any G7 country. And the other countries in the G7 who didn't go through with a Keynesian approach failed.
Yeah.
And they stuck with the neoliberal mindset. And now they're in a worse economic condition than the United States.
Yeah.
The United Kingdom, most of all. The United Kingdom is a train wreck. We'll talk about that next week.
Sure.
But I think this is the death of neoliberalism. And there was a great issue of The Economist published last year, maybe a year and a half ago. It was after the American Rescue Plan was packed. And it was titled "The Age of Small Government is Over." And I think it is.
Biden really is the first Keynesian since Lyndon Johnson, just about.
Yeah.
It's impressive because when I was reading about this stagflation and really trying to understand it, I was like, okay, you're spending a lot from the government, because something I didn't mention, the stagflation in the 70s, part of it was because of government money being poured in from Johnson's social plans as well as into the Vietnam War.
Mm-hmm.
So we're doing that, and we are facing a really difficult economic turmoil as well with COVID, right? And what if these inflation expectations just continue? What if we just get caught in stagflation? And the truth is, this is where economics kind of ceases to be a science.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a matter of fine-tuning and just having your hand on the dial and trying to be as discerning as you can as the government leader.
Right.
And to me, it's quite impressive that we have avoided recession.
Yeah.
We do keep gaining jobs. Inflation is finally coming down. Like Biden or his administration or whoever's in charge.
Yeah, whatever.
They're turning that dial to get us to the right place. And Keynesianism might be able to win again.
And what's interesting is this is a rejection of it is a rejection of the Hayek notion that any socialism is so bad.
Yeah.
Or it's hard because his terms of socialism is so incorrect, but any government intervention is bad.
Well, it definitely it disproves the slippery slope, or at least it discourages that idea, because the threat to democracy
is coming from the other side.
Exactly.
It's coming from the neoliberal side, because Trump is a neoliberal.
You think so?
I think Trump is still a neoliberal.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. As far as that spectrum, Trump is just different on a different spectrum.
He's just a narcissistic scumbag.
Yeah.
Right? He's not I don't know. I don't know if he believes anything at all, to be honest.
Yeah.
I'm serious. But anyway, I think neoliberalism is on its deathbed, and I'm happy to be a part of a world where it looks like a new economic mode might be coming.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's going to be Keynesianism as we know it. It's going to be something new. I think it's going to be this social democratic framework. I think it's going to go beyond Keynes.
You think so?
Yeah, I think it will go beyond what Keynes did.
That'll be cool.
And it'll be interesting to be a part of it.
As leaders of the political commentary, we'll have a big say.
Yeah, so. Yeah. We're actually, we get scripts from the Biden administration every week to talk about these things that only look good for him.
Yeah, and
as many of you say in the comments.
And in return, we get to have 15 minutes of conversation with him every week. Yeah, just trying to peddle our own ideas.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was a hell of a ride. Neoliberalism
neoliberalism
was a beast to learn about.
Yeah. Yeah, it does make me feel smarter. And I have no idea what we'll talk about next week, but I'm sure it'll be cool.
Yeah, it always is. All right,
See
bye,
you
guys.